All right. So welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and just get started with the last segment of our Zero Trust webinar series for this year. We're going to be talking about, practical ways to meet U.S. government requirements for Zero Trust. We're going to break down a few of the, most common regulations or mandates or guidance documents, reference architectures that are out there, like NIST 800-207 and M2209, etc. And then we're going to talk about how I like to break things down and take things bite by bite, chunk by chunk, or as what you'll see, dot by dot. So I like to call it connecting the dots. It's really an easy way to break down the fundamentals of what's in the environment, how those things that are in the environment meet the zero trust requirements or the zero trust goals of the customer. And then also, how they can work together to create an orchestrated architecture that can solve and get things to an optimal state for zero trust. So without further ado, we'll talk a little bit. I'll introduce myself here. So my name's Chad Mitchell. I was a Cisco engineer, technical solutions architect, team lead, managing lived a little bit of time in management, but I spent all 9 years of my time at Cisco covering U.S. public sector. CCIE did some writing on books with Jamie. If you were in the previous two webinars, Jamie was talking on those. And I spent a lot of time doing deployments. I deployed hundreds of different solutions, primarily Cisco based, but worked with many, many customers over the years doing post-sales delivery, doing proof of values, and so forth. So putting those tools into work and how they integrate with the environment, how they solve the problems, especially with new things like zero trust, is kind of what I've focused on for the majority of my career. So this is the third webinar. If you haven't seen the first two, there's their titles. There is an on-demand available on the Modern Cyber website. So you're welcome to go on there and get the links for those and watch those if those are something that interests you as well. So a little bit of an overview. So, what are the requirements? As I mentioned, we're going to talk about a few of those, and then how we're going to take a different approach and connect the dots. And, it's really about breaking down. So full disclosure, a lot of this was stemmed from a lot of research I did with something like Cisco safe reference architectures, as well as a lot of work that I did with, the leaders at CISA when they were doing their initial draft of the maturity model and reference architecture, and how policy enforcement, when we talk about zero trust, can exist anywhere within that traffic path, and it really requires an orchestrated environment, systems that work together, and we'll talk through each of those things. So the first one we're going to talk about is M2209, which is, subject was moving the U.S. government towards zero trust cybersecurity principles, right? The biggest quote and the most impactful quote that I see in this document right at the beginning is that the federal government can no longer depend on perimeter-based security defenses. So I always like to call that the Tootsie Roll problem: hard, crunchy outside, soft, gooey center, right? So being able to no longer set up this wall or this moat around our castle, around our network, around our enterprise environment. When we look at things that have evolved and moved into the cloud, when we look at users working from all over the world, that kind of breaks that mentality, and the use of VPNs becoming more and more, I wouldn't say cumbersome, but less adopted in the sake of things like cloud software as a service and things like that. Security has to kind of exist from the endpoint to the resource, and any security mechanism that we're passing through to get there, whether it's on our actual premises or something like in the cloud. So furthermore, into M2209, you'll start to see them talk about these different bullet points of things that need to be done. And I highlighted kind of the keywords there. So enterprise managed accounts, devices that are tracked and monitored, systems are isolated from each other. and encrypted. Availability, so applications being available, like I mentioned earlier, with the cloud and so forth. And then categories and automatically detection, data categories and automatic detection and response. Um, and if you've seen any presentations about zero trust and you've seen, kind of some of the reference architectures, other scenarios out there, these should probably ring true to you into the form of what, is commonly referred to as pillars of zero trust. So, I like to reference 5. So there's identity, device, network, application, and data. And this is really just kind of taking those things that we saw on the previous slide and highlighting them into the quote unquote pillars that they reside within. The next thing that we look at is, okay, there's 5 pillars, but depending on who you talk to, there could be 6. Sometimes there's 7. So the reason I put this slide on here is that, no matter what you look at, the domains or the pillars or the segments of the network all are the same in most cases. There may be an outlier here or there, but that first one right up top, when we look at Forrester Zero Trust Extended and their diagram, each of the pillars of the CISA Zero Trust model or maturity model, and even some of the foundational items like their visibility, analytics, and automation map directly into that ZTS extended diagram. When you look at the DoD 7 pillars, you look at the names of those, they are all the same names as the, for the most part, as the, 5-pillar scenario. Whereas we don't look at, if we're looking at the CISA model, for instance, that one on the top right, when we look at visibility and analytics and automation orchestration, they kind of extend across the entire architecture rather than be their own pillars on their own. So keep the pillars in mind as we go through this. We're going to talk about a couple of the other scenarios that are out there, but keep those pillars in mind because they're going to come back around here when we start getting into maturity model and then when we start looking at how we break it down. So the next one we want to look at is NIST 800-207. Right off of the NIST main page for 800-207, focuses on protecting resources and a network location is no longer seen as the prime component of security posture. So again, just a different way of saying those perimeter-based defenses are no longer adequate for security for the U.S. government, civilian, DoD, whoever it may be. NIST has a reference architecture that is very, very similar in the regards of, you have a lot of these different inputs, like identity, like, all of those pillars we talked about. But what they do in the reference architecture is they talk about, okay, well, we want to look at the flow from subject to resource. So I have my users or my endpoint that's sitting out there on the far left, and I have my resources, whether it's something in the cloud, whether it's in a data center, etc. But it starts to bring in the elements of, okay, as I'm going between that subject and that resource, I need to put some type of enforcement point in that data flow. And that enforcement point could be one, it could be many, it could be anywhere within that data flow. But the one big thing that they reference in the architecture is that the connectivity, so whether you're in an office or you're in a home office or you're at Starbucks or you're across a VPN, we don't want any of that to be a definition of how much we trust that traffic. That's just a transport, that's a data plane transport at that point. And while there could be policy and enforcement points that are within that data plane, it's not an element of trust. The location or how the connection is happening is not an element of how much we trust that endpoint. We want to look deeper into those elements of the 5 pillars. You'll also see across the bottom of the zero trust or of the NIST 800-207, it brings a lot of policy engine inputs. So this is where we start looking at automation, orchestration, visibility, and analytics. So those policy enforcement points and the decision points, which are controlling the enforcement points, are receiving all this additional data to be able to make more efficient and have a higher efficacy on the decisions that it makes on how to process that traffic, whether we're going to trust it or we're going to block it. So again, you'll see this as a common scenario as we go through all of them. One of the biggest things that I see highlighted in NIST 800-207, though, over any of the other ones, is that the enforcement is not required to exist all in one place. And it's not a head end, a data center, everything's in the cloud. The reality is that it can exist anywhere between the subject, even on the endpoint itself, or on the resource that's housing that data. Policy enforcement point can be one or many, and it can be anywhere in that traffic flow. So the last one we're going to talk about when we're talking about zero trust and U.S. public sector requirements is probably the most popular one that you've seen. I mean, NIST 800-207 and 2209 have been out for quite a while. But one of the best parts of, those are the reference architectures. Then, well, now I want to be able to say, okay, well, how far do I need to take this? How mature do I need to make the system? And so CISA came out with what's called their Zero Trust Maturity Model. They just released the version 2.0 early last year. And the goal of the maturity model is to assist the agencies in their plans and designs and how they implement the security solutions. And they do this by creating tiers of maturity, right? So are we doing things traditionally, or are we doing things in an optimal form or somewhere in between? And 5 pillars of maturity, so that just the 5 pillars that we talked about earlier, and then 3 cross-cutting capabilities. Maturity model specific, traditional, and initial, advanced, and optimal are the 4 tiers that it kind of gets you into when you start looking at how mature is my zero trust when I look at my environment. So again, the 5 pillars that you saw previously, but on the right-hand side is where you see kind of the breakdown of, okay, within each of these pillars, if you are doing X, Y, or Z, then you're going to fall into the traditional or the advanced or the optimal stage. Now, best of both worlds is to have everything be at optimal, right? But the reality and the complexity and the cost of being at optimal may not be a fit. And we'll talk about that a little bit here. But the one thing I also like to highlight on this is that you see how no matter what tier you're at, visibility and analytics and automation and orchestration and governance extend across all of the pillars. And one of the key words that key things I talk to every customer about when we start talking about zero trust is that we need to be able to see what is considered to be normal. So visibility being a key analytic or foundational item of zero trust is that we need to be able to see what is happening on the network to be able to make decisions on how far we go with zero trust. And I say the network, but I probably should have said the network as well as the identity providers, as well as how data is moving in your environment, etc. Visibility analytics extends into all of those pillars, but having that visibility of what's happening before making decisions on going to optimal for devices, let's say, if their devices have a standard image load and they have all the different EDR systems and so forth in place, then advanced may be the top tier that your organization may want to go to. And with that being said, when we look at zero trust and we start analyzing how zero trust gets applied within the environment, obviously there's the mountain of goals to get through to get to optimal. As I mentioned, it is quite a bit in cost and work to get there. But sometimes it is an elemental or a incremental step, right? Taking that step, going from your traditional username and password today, evolving into username and password with MFA, and then evolving even further into more capabilities with device posture or identity monitoring within the cloud, etc. But then what we do with a lot of customers when we start talking about maturity is we start identifying and asking them, like, where do you think you fall in this maturity model, right? Do you think that your data is classified and that it's always encrypted in motion and at rest? When you look at identity, are you doing not only authentication, but also MFA and other capabilities? And we start to break things down even further into that radar chart that you see on the right-hand side, where, again, the goal for each organization may be different. It may not be about getting all the way out to the outside of that Pentagon and the radar, but, it may be a mixture of that and evolving and growing out to where that is comfortable. Now, I say that because I want to highlight something that I talked with Sean Connolly at CISA about quite a few times, is that the maturity model, the reference architectures, etc. In the past, it had always been kind of a descriptive. When we look at things like now I forget the name of it. The regional stacks, right? That used to be distributed out. It was always, you had to have a firewall, you had to have an IPS, you had to have X, Y, and Z. It was a must do this. When we look at the reference architectures, it's more about prescriptive and how it's commonly seen or should be done. Now, I always like to also highlight here that, it is an idea of identifying the risk tolerance of the agency as well as the risk profile. If the risk profile is low, the risk tolerance is probably high. Actually, no, sorry, the risk tolerance is high. Yeah. Low profile, high tolerance, right? They're willing to take a lot of risk because the profile of what could be lost is not very secretive. But then if you start to look at somebody that has a very high risk profile, their tolerance is going to be very low. So you're going to start looking at, how do I get to more optimal states across all of the pillars? So I know that's a lot to kind of take in, right? There's all these steps, all these different tiers, all these pillars, et cetera, et cetera. Well, we're going to try and break it down a little bit, because it's not about, buying something. It's not about, turning on a new knob on one product. The one thing I want to talk about is start out with an analogy. And I'll let you guys think about this for a second, but these are three elements that a company changed, or they changed one element, I'm sorry, and these are three outcomes of that one element that they changed. So they got 20 million less miles on their trucks, they were able to deliver 350,000 more packages, and they burned 20,000 less metric tons of CO2, or they created less CO2. The company that did this is actually UPS. And when you look at how they did it, it's a change of mindset, right? So all they did to achieve those increases in efficiency was they said, you can't make left turns. We're going to design the routes to be to make left turns as few times as possible, if not at all, right? So they said, the amount of time that you're sitting at a left turn at a light, trying to turn out across a lane of traffic, there is no light, or the amount of times that you get hit because you're trying to pull out across 2 or 3 lanes of traffic to make a left-hand turn. All of those things came into the elements of less mileage, increased safety, less CO2 emissions. And they basically just said, we're going to turn right as many times as we possibly can. So that was just a change of process. It wasn't a new electric truck. It wasn't anything along those lines. It was just a change of process and not a new product. So when I think about how to achieve zero trust and I start talking to customers, we got, not that one, think different. Nope, not that one. We got to think differently, right? So we got to change how we look at the security tools and how we look at the capabilities within the environment to be able to achieve the goals of the customer, right? So we're going to break it down now into the dots that I talked about, connecting the dots. The first thing I'll say is that zero trust is not a single product. So when you look at CISA, I think this is probably right within the first paragraph as well, like the quote I had earlier, but it says, may require a change in organization's philosophy and culture around cybersecurity. So zero trust is a system. It is multiple things working together, as well as users, right? Our users are always part of the equation, but it's policies, visibility, controls, monitoring, and enforcement. That is what zero trust is. And when we look at it in a big nutshell, it's how we're going to apply those policies and so forth. That is kind of the big hurdle that a lot of people have a hard time getting over. So when I think about zero trust and I think about, all of the different elements that go into zero trust and applying an architecture that achieves it, I think of it like a CMYK or a Liechtenstein, right? Um, a Liechtenstein, or even when you think about CMYK and printers and so forth, it's a lot of dots, and those dots are placed in a specific location to render a color to the viewer, right? So we look at pop art like Liechtenstein. The further away we get, the more that the colors come together, and the smoother of a picture it creates, etc. But when we get down to the nitty gritty of it, it's a red dot, a blue dot, or CMYK, cayenne, magenta, yellow, or black, right? So we want to get down to, okay, what dots do I need to put in what place to be able to achieve the optimal security architecture that I want under zero trust? So you may be asking, what are the dots, right? Well, the dots are controls, right? We talked about policy enforcement points. Policy enforcement point controls, one and the same thing. But when you think about controls, controls aren't just a product, controls are a function of that product. So as you may have seen in reports in the past, some large organizations, or a large portion of large organizations, have over 50 different security products that they're managing and have implemented in the environment. So when we look at the controls, we want to look at, well, what can each of those tools do? And how can we leverage each of the capabilities of that tool to apply the policy and enforce it in our zero trust architecture. So further break down the dots, I have a firewall or I need a firewall control to segment my network. So that's really kind of the two things. I've got the control and I want to use it to segment. So this is where I'm going to start doing that user isolation that we talked about in the network pillar of the zero trust reference architecture. So as you can imagine, the dots can get many, right? I like to call it the controls alphabet. But when we start breaking down every single capability that every single tool may have out there, we look at things like tagging. That could be tagging of frames with something like Cisco TrustSec, or could be tagging data as classified or sensitive or compartmentalized, etc. We look at logging and reporting. Every tool that should be a basic foundational tool of every solution that you implement. But how can that logging and reporting be correlated or captured in a way that can further increase the efficacy of alerts and alarms and so forth? So each of these different controls or dots, are a capability of the environment or a policy enforcement point. So we take that a step further and we start to look at, okay, I'm trying to achieve zero trust. I know here are my use cases within my environment. How can I look at the totality of the products that I have, the capabilities of each of those products, and then identify what would be the zero trust, or how would I apply the policy for my zero trust goals to that flow or to that use case? So we start to break it down by looking at business flows. So here we've got a scenario of an agency user trying to access sensitive data. So when we break that down into identity, the first pillar of zero trust in all of the reference architectures, we have that human, asset, right, or that human attribute. We have a username, we have a certificate that was issued on a CAC card, we have a phone that we're doing MFA, whatever it may be. I now have that identity. So I now have identified who the user is, and then I now want to look at, okay, well, what about their device? So we start breaking down into each of the pillars. For this flow of agency user to sensitive data, I want to know who the user is. I want to know if their device is clean, and if their device has the proper security controls on it and protections. Then we start to look at, okay, well, what are they going to go through in the network, in that traffic path to get from point A to point B, from subject to resource? Well, we know based on our network that we have a firewall, we have an intrusion prevention system, we have NetFlow analytics, and we've got threat intelligence capabilities. So we now are marking off each of these different capabilities And then lastly, we've got the application. So we're looking at, not only what ports and protocols that users interacting with the application, but maybe even how that application is communicating between the web front end, the application tier, and the backend database. So, each of those different elements can come into that business flow. So breaking it down into individual steps as to how a user gets from point A to point B, and identifying that, okay, based on the controls that we have, or the solutions that we have and the capabilities of those solutions, how can we apply zero trust principles to that data flow? So it's all about breaking it down into business flows. So this is just showing a couple more examples of that. Now, I ask you to kind of look at this picture, kind of broaden your sight of it. Don't read everything into it, but look at what does it kind of look like? It harkens back to the NIST 800-207 reference architecture, right? So we have that, subject talking to a resource with policy enforcement points within that traffic flow. And then the other key part that I'll bring up again is that we want to make sure that all of these solutions are integrating as much as possible with each other, whether it's through logging and correlation on a security incident and event management, or it's through direct integrations between two products. That's going to be a key part of being able to have the policy enforcement points make efficient decisions based on policy as to what they want to permit and deny. So to tie the three things we kind of all talked about from, M2209, 800-207, and CISA reference or CISA maturity model, we could start to look at flows like this. So if we break down everything into our different pillars, we look at our foundation of zero trust. We've got our visibility, analytics, automation, orchestration, etc., all feeding into each of those different systems to identify not only who the user is, what device they're on, how they're accessing the data, etc., but we can actually start to break down and we start to look at each of those flows. So this is very similar to kind of the use case that we showed earlier, where we broke down each of the controls in the traffic path. This is kind of throwing everything together at once, right? So we can take it, a customer environment, we can say, okay, what solutions do you have within identity? We can put all of those into that column, and then we can do the same for devices, network, application, etc. And then we can start to say, okay, well, for this particular use case of this user trying to access this resource, what would be the controls that we would put into that flow? And we start to break things down like this. So, the ability to kind of have that holistic view of how the different tools are going to work together to achieve zero trust and achieve the maturity that we want, but also how the different solutions or capabilities kind of fall into that traffic flow. Now, with that being said, I'm going to also bring up some of the key items to consider as well. From the years that I was working with government agencies, one of them comes to mind almost every single time, and it's actually the last one on this slide here. But key items to think about that, Jamie and I worked with a customer one time where we had, I think it was probably about 25 security products that were in the environment, and for most of them, there was two tools that did the same exact thing that were both doing it. Like, so let's say that the security team had an IPS and the network team had a firewall, and real basic example there, but they were inspecting traffic twice in some way, shape, or form, or they were doing authentication multiple times as the traffic was going through, whether it was authenticating to the web proxy and then authenticating to the application or whatever it may be. But feature and function overlap is really the main point of starting to break those things down into capabilities or controls, and being able to say, okay, we know that the network team has product X, Y, and Z. Product X, Y, and Z is capable of doing all of these things. And I say capable because you see my second bullet is license functionality. Is that if that device is capable of doing it, we want to make sure that we make note of it. Once we've identified all the capabilities that are in the environment, we can also start to look at how those devices can interact with each other so that when a firewall inspects traffic, it can tell something upstream that, hey, I've already inspected this traffic, it's clean, you don't need to do it again. License functionality, as I mentioned, existing tools may have the capability to do more than they're currently capable of doing because they just don't have the license. And then the last one is probably the hardest one that I have had to deal with over my years is that the separation of duties, right? And getting teams, when we look at zero trust and the network being abstracted completely from security and so forth, being able to get teams to work together to identify how different solutions within the environment, no matter who they're owned by, can share data, can share context, and can share the end result of enforcing the zero trust policy within the environment. So I probably went through all of this pretty quickly. I do want to highlight a couple things. Just I want to reiterate that zero trust is not just a single product, right? So identifying and implementing the tools in a way that work together with multiple products is really the goal, and kind of to bring up that CISA statement is where we see a lot of customers having to deal with that change of philosophy and how they do security. No longer the network is our battleground, or it's our safe harbor, and everything outside of it is the battleground. It is a scenario of everything having to work together to achieve it. And then when we look at zero trust from the CISA architecture or CISA reference model, CISA maturity model, and the reference architectures that are out there, the key point is that I try to talk to every customer in U.S. public sector that I can, that it is not a you must do. It is a you should do as much as your risk tolerance and your risk profile defines you to do. So again, changing the philosophy and not just saying that, okay, this is what I was told I had to do, so this is what I'm going to implement, and I met the requirements, and I don't need to do any more. It's more around identifying really what is your tolerance and how much security do you need to have in place. So a little bit of an overview about Modern Cyber. So founded last year, based out of Melbourne, Florida. We try to take a modern approach to doing things, as you saw, trying to break down security outside of products into capabilities. We really focus a lot on zero trust. We have quite a few projects where it's either ICE implementation or assessing a customer's network to define or help them define what their zero trust architecture should look like based on all of the different things, their risk, etc. And then we put as much information as we can about zero trust out on the knowledge base. So if you have time, go ahead and check that out. We also like to consider ourselves the Sherpas. So when we look at this diagram, we look at a product or a vendor like Cisco that we've worked with for years and for. But Cisco had a lot of the elements, right? We have the tents, they have the helmets, they have the boots, and so forth. Getting all of those elements together and on at the right time and up the mountain, right? How do we get them to help us progress through the journey up to optimal state or whatever level it may be? That's really where we try to focus our efforts and our modern approach on finding ways to make those systems work together, integrations, automations, and really just implementation with best practices is a lot of what we focus on. And every implementation that we do, we try to identify how far we want to go up that route, how far do we want to get to zero trust based on the customer's requirements, needs, etc. So we do assessment, we do deployments, as I mentioned, and then we also have a managed service. We do NAC as a service and zero trust as a service. So all of those are things that we can work with. We also do a lot of custom things as well. So we've done quite a few or a couple, I should say, custom integrations, new product capabilities, or just even proving the art of the possible is something that we enjoy doing. So I know I left quite a bit of time for questions. So if there are any questions, you guys are more than welcome to pop them into the Q&A. I'm going to go ahead and pull it up here if there are any. I don't see any, but if anybody has got any, feel free to put them in. We'll hang out for a few more minutes. And then if you're looking for the recording of this to share with anyone, please check back on the Zero Trust Knowledge Base and Zero Trust Workshop website. We will have that posted up there here shortly. So with that, I'll go on mute and I look forward to any questions you guys have, and thank you for your time today.